My worst fears have come true. A game developer is officially using frame generation as a crutch to achieve 30 FPS. And I don't mean 30 FPS doubled to 60 FPS through frame gen, I'm talking about a 30 FPS output with frame generation enabled. That's a render rate of just 15 FPS listed on an official spec sheet for an upcoming title. This is really bad, and I'm going to show you why. So the game in question is LEGO Batman Legacy of the Dark Knight, which is set to be released on May 22nd. The official PC system requirements for this game were detailed about a day ago, and on the surface there's nothing hugely surprising here. The recommended requirements call for something like a Ryzen 7 5800X, 16GB of RAM, and either a GeForce RTX 2070 Super, Radeon RX 6650 XT, or Intel Arc B580. That's fairly modest hardware by today's standards. It's mid-range to entry-level stuff from several years ago. Then we have the 4K spec listing more powerful components, including a Core i7 14700K with an RTX 4070 or RX 9070 XT as the required GPU. And the minimum spec, which is very basic, Ryzen 5 1600, along with things like a GeForce GTX 960, Radeon RX 6400 or Intel Arc A580. These are all very slow GPUs in 2026. But what caught my eye are the details surrounding these system requirements. At 4K, they are claiming this hardware is needed to run the game at 2160p, 60 FPS, with DLSS, FSR or XeSS quality enabled and FrameGen enabled. This means that hardware is required to natively render the game at 1440p 30 FPS, with upscaling and FrameGen used to achieve the 4K 60 FPS output. Then it gets worse. The recommended spec suggests medium settings, 1440p at 60 FPS, again using DLSS, FSR or XeSS quality with FrameGen enabled. So now we're talking about a 960p native render resolution at 30 FPS. And the really egregious stuff happens in the minimum tier. The hardware required for minimum is weak, but the developers here are saying the game will actually be rendering with low settings at 1080p 30 FPS with FSR or XeSS balanced enabled and FrameGen enabled. That's a render resolution of just 635p using quite a high level of upscaling at a 1080p resolution and at a render rate of 15 FPS. 15 FPS. Absolute madness that this configuration is listed officially. Traveller's Tales have developed this latest LEGO Batman game, the same long-time developers that have worked on past LEGO titles like the Skywalker Saga, but they've made a major change with this newest iteration. The Star Wars Skywalker Saga was developed using TT's proprietary Entity game engine, and past LEGO titles also used various in-house engines. However, the Entity engine was difficult to use according to a Polygon report citing multiple developers that worked on the game, and this contributed to extreme crunch to get the title finished in time for release. Internally, the studio wanted to switch to Unreal Engine, but management didn't want to do so due to licensing costs. This led to the studio eventually deciding to switch to Unreal Engine 5 for LEGO Batman Legacy of the Dark, and we all know the situation with Unreal Engine and performance issues on PC. This has been well documented over many years now. Of course, we haven't tested LEGO Batman to see how the performance and visuals stack up, but most of the titles we've tested recently with disappointing performance and optimization have used Unreal Engine, so the system requirements hinting at a low level of performance isn't exactly surprising. The problem with these system specs is that frame generation is being used as a crutch to advertise certain levels of quote-unquote performance. Most gamers would find playing a title like this unpleasant at 30 FPS, but advertising 60 FPS is much more acceptable, so slap some frame generation on and call it a day. Only if you read everything closely, and only if you properly understand how FrameGen works, does it become evident that an RTX 4070 actually can't play this game at 4K 60 FPS, but at 4K 30 FPS. The issue with using frame generation as a crutch is that frame generation doesn't improve performance. In fact, enabling it actually reduces performance in most situations. That's with a traditional, long-held definition of what performance means for gaming. Some companies, Nvidia, have argued with us about this definition and say that FrameGen performance is better because the output frame rate is higher, but that's just not true. Performance in gaming refers to a combination of elements that go into making the experience enjoyable. Higher output frame rates make the game smoother as more frames are being delivered to your eyeballs, and on most modern displays this also improves motion clarity because higher frame rates produce less blur. But on top of this, rendering the game at a higher rate, so faster with more performance, also reduces input latency. This last element is crucial because it makes the game feel better to play. Responsiveness is improved, controls feel nicer, and in multiplayer titles, it's actually been proven to make you better and more successful. That's because with lower input lag, it's easier to react and target enemies. Throughout history, when everyone has talked about the performance of a game, they're referring to all of these benefits together. When there's talk about the benefits of better performance, like a game running at 60 FPS versus lower performance like running at 30 FPS, all of these things come up. 60 FPS gaming is smoother, less blurry, less of a slideshow, it feels better to play, controls are less sluggish, and the game is easier. Prior to frame generation, these factors have always been tightly linked. If your GPU and CPU can render the game at a higher frame rate, you get a smoother output and lower input latency. The FPS a game runs at is then synonymous with performance. Gamers want those GPU upgrades to hit 120 FPS because they know that means all the elements of better performance. But when frame generation is used to achieve a certain output frame rate, you're not getting better performance. This is because frame generation increases the output frame rate, but it does not improve latency. As a result, using frame generation only gives you half of the benefits we typically attribute to a higher FPS. The standard relationship between FPS and performance is now broken, so we can't describe an FPS increase due to frame generation as a performance increase. This is a phenomenon that we've shown in all of our frame generation coverage, but I think we showed it best in our multi-frame gen exploration from last year. Take this example from Cyberpunk 2077, running on a GeForce RTX 5090 using ultra settings with reflex enabled for all configurations. Without frame gen enabled, the game runs at 78 FPS. Switching on frame gen gives us a sizable frame rate boost up to 139 FPS with 2x frame gen, which generates a single frame between each rendered frame. 3x frame gen with 2 generated frames bumps us up to 197 FPS, and then 4x frame gen with 3 generated frames gives us 250 FPS. If the output frame rate is all that we showed here, you'd be pretty happy to hear that 2x frame gen increased FPS by nearly 80%. Look at all that performance. But now let's look at the latency, measured in milliseconds where lower is faster and better. Without frame generation, the game ran at 34 milliseconds of latency, but when we enable frame gen, latency actually goes backwards, increasing to 40 milliseconds in the 2x mode, 42 milliseconds in the 3x mode, and 44 milliseconds in the 4x mode. This is because using frame generation comes at a small performance cost, an overhead from using GPU time to generate the additional frame. From the output frame rate, we can calculate the actual native render rate the game is running at, which forms the true basis of performance. When you enable frame generation, the render rate of the game decreases from 78 to 69 FPS and drops even further when additional frames are generated. When we equalize the output frame rate in all modes, you can clearly see what this does to latency. The true 120 FPS output with no frame generation gives us high responsiveness with latency of just 24 milliseconds. But if we decide to achieve 120 FPS using frame generation, actually running the game at a native render rate of 60 FPS, latency increases massively to 48 milliseconds. And then it increases further using 3x and 4x modes. This seriously affects the feel of the game. Using frame generation makes the game feel more sluggish and less responsive as input lag is higher. It's that simple. But in contrast, if you are running a game at 60 FPS and you either installed a faster GPU to increase the render rate to 120 FPS, or you change settings in the game to increase the render rate to 120 FPS, latency would significantly decrease, you would get a performance improvement, and the game would feel better to run. Now, these examples were designed around a 120 FPS target output, but the same principle applies if the target output is 60 FPS. When TT Games advertise LEGO Batman running at 60 FPS with FrameGen enabled, what they mean is the game will feel like it's being played at 30 FPS, which for many gamers is a big red flag that the game will not be enjoyable to play. And that 30 FPS configuration is even worse. With frame generation achieving that output, the game will feel like it's running at 15 FPS, which is absolutely horrible. Frame generation not improving latency is totally fine if the technology is used correctly. If you're happy with how the game feels to play, if the render rate is decent, latency is decent, it makes sense to enable frame generation to benefit from increased smoothness. There will be a small increase in latency when frame gen is enabled, but at a high base render rate that's not going to matter too much, and the smoothness benefits will outweigh the performance cost. In our Cyberpunk example, the base render rate is close to 80 FPS, it only drops to 70 FPS with frame gen enabled, but the output is a much smoother 140 FPS, so that's a decent configuration that could be worth using if you're happy with the feel of 70 FPS gaming. But the problem with frame gen being used to target 60 FPS is that the latency experience is equivalent to 30 FPS. Most PC gamers today are not happy with the feel of 30 FPS gaming and will avoid running games like that at all costs. I'm not the most latency sensitive gamer personally, but I find 30 FPS gameplay horrible, even in single player titles, as the controls are slow and the character I'm playing is just not responsive enough. It's crucial game developers don't use frame generation as a crutch to optimize their games and improve performance. Just imagine two paths that could be taken. There's one path where optimization is worked on to get the game running at a true 60 FPS, and there's another path where optimization stops at 30 FPS and frame gen is slapped on at the end. The game that actually runs at a true 60 FPS will be much more enjoyable to play. The output of frame generated 60 FPS is not the same. It's bad. Using the technology this way does not mean you have optimized the title or are delivering good performance. In fact, in most situations, if a PC gamer loads into a game and they're only getting 30 FPS without frame gen, I would think they'd turn down settings instead of enabling frame gen, and failing that, if overall performance is looking bad and frame generation is the only solution to increasing the frame rate, I think a lot of gamers will leave a negative Steam review and maybe even refund the game, which is exactly what we saw happen at the launch of Borderlands 4, with waves of criticism around how heavy the game was on modest hardware. You can't just hide away from low native frame rates and say you should use frame generation. That's just not how it works. And putting the whole latency angle aside for a moment, frame generation is primarily designed to improve smoothness and overall visual quality, but it can only do that effectively at relatively high frame rates. Running this technology at a low frame rate exposes the flaws of generated frames in a way that high frame rates do not. That's firstly because the difference between each rendered frame is larger at a lower frame rate, so the generated frames need to interpolate a lot more to fill in the gaps, and secondly, because each frame is shown on screen for a longer time before flicking over to a rendered frame, making artifacts more visible. Higher frame rate frame generation is simply much better visually. All the companies that have created frame generation solutions know this too. NVIDIA recommends a final output of at least 120 FPS when evaluating frame gen, and using a high refresh rate monitor to do so due to the many frames sent to the display. Intel recommends a base frame rate of 60 FPS for XeSS frame gen or 40 FPS for entry-level graphics. In none of these situations is 30 to 60 FPS frame gen recommended, and 15 to 30 FPS is so far away from the recommendations it may as well be an illegal configuration. And again, this is not to say that frame gen is useless, it just has minimum requirements for a good experience. It can improve smoothness and clarity, but it doesn't do this very well at a 15 or 30 FPS render rate. In fact, I briefly looked at what a 1080p output with FSR balance would look like when frame generation is used to achieve a 30 FPS output, the exact configuration TT Games have listed for the minimum spec. And yeah, I mean, it goes without saying this is an awful way to play, below what I think is acceptable for minimum level gaming. The other thing with frame generation is that it's supposed to be an optional feature gamers can use if they want enhanced smoothness. It's not meant to be used as a technology to achieve a target level of performance because, as I explained, it's not actually improving performance. In fact, it needs to be optional because enabling it reduces the render rate of the game and increases latency, so latency sensitive gamers wouldn't want to use it. Making frame generation mandatory to hit a certain output level would be the same as making motion blur mandatory. After all, frame generation is essentially a fancier, better version of motion blur. What do I mean by that? Well, motion blur's main purpose in a lot of games is to blur frames together when the output frame rate is low, reducing the slideshow effect and making the game look smoother. Motion blur doesn't actually increase the performance of the game when doing so, but it can look smoother. Frame generation achieves the same goal of improved smoothness through creating interpolated frames, and usually it does so in a way that looks much better than motion blur, with a lot less, well, blur. It would be pretty dumb to put on a system requirement sheet that the recommended configuration is to play the game at 30 FPS with motion blur enabled. The same principle applies to listing frame generation with the 60 FPS output. Both run the game at a 30 FPS render rate, with a graphics feature attempting to increase smoothness. But because frame generation technically does increase the FPS output to 60 FPS in this situation, it can be used for wrong and potentially misleading purposes. In the case of LEGO Batman, using frame gen to target 60 FPS with a given hardware configuration is wrong. It's not what frame gen is designed for, and it leads to a bad experience. And this all ties back into what we were saying when we first encountered and tested frame generation. Our concern back at the time was that various companies would use frame generation as a weapon to mislead gamers and deliver subpar experiences. Nvidia has been using frame generation as a misleading marketing weapon for years now, making dumb and wrong claims like the RTX 5070 is equivalent to an RTX 4090 in performance because it can generate more frames. Again, frame gen doesn't improve performance, so this isn't true. But developers can weaponize it as well through 30 to 60 FPS frame gen configurations, and now the even worse 15 to 30 FPS option. I was most worried about this on consoles that have limited GPU performance and limited setting options, but it's filtering across to PC gaming as well, seemingly in the place of proper optimization. With all of that in mind, if we remove the garbage of frame generation in the LEGO Batman Legacy of the Dark Knight system requirements, is what we are seeing reasonable? The developers are basically saying this game will run at 4K 30 FPS on an RTX 4070 or RX 9070 XT with quality upscaling. They're also saying an RTX 2070 Super or RX 6650 XT will run it at 1440p 30 FPS with medium settings and quality upscaling. This would make LEGO Batman a very taxing title. It's probably not going to be as taxing as Borderlands 4, a game we found to run at 14 FPS with native 4K rendering on an RTX 4070 with max settings, and 29 FPS using 1440p native. That was at launch before the latest performance improving patches. But we're certainly talking in the ballpark of the most intensive Unreal Engine 5 games. Stalker 2, for example, runs on an RTX 4070 at 43 FPS using 4K epic settings and quality DLSS upscaling. Based on TT Games' system requirements, LEGO Batman will be pretty similar to that. Anyway, that's it for this one. Needless to say, I was pretty unimpressed to see frame generation listed in this way on the LEGO Batman system requirements that were published about a day ago. So yeah, just had to put this video together because it's something that's been weighing on me for a little while now, this whole concept of frame generation not improving performance, but developers in some cases trying to use it as an excuse to sort of say, well, if your performance isn't adequate, you can improve it using frame gen. We saw that with Borderlands 4. It's just not how it works. So yeah, anyway, this video is then made based on that. So if you want to support Hardware Unboxed, all the usual stuff, we've got Patreon, links to that is in the description below. If you sign up, you gain access to benefits, Discord community, monthly live streams, BTS content, plenty of other good stuff. But yeah, that'll do it for this one. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.